There's a moment, quiet, barely noticeable, when an animal realizes it's safe. Not just for now, but maybe forever. You can see it in the way their breathing slows, the way their eyes stop scanning every shadow, the way their body, once coiled in survival, begins to unfold like a patch of snow melting in the sun. This is the story of a polar bear cub who had nothing left to trust. Until one man showed up in the middle of the frozen Alaskan coast. Not to tame her, not to keep her, but to give her a chance at something wild and rare: peace. He thought she was the one who needed saving. But what unfolded next would prove maybe it was the other way around. Because sometimes the heart doesn't just find a home, it remembers one. And when it does something unexpected, happens something that changes everything. What you're about to hear isn't just about a wild animal finding sanctuary. It's about the healing that begins when two broken souls stop running, and the moment a polar bear cub realized she was finally heading to her forever home, only to face a twist no one could have seen coming. Let's begin in Barrow, Alaska, where the ocean is often frozen and the air carries the hush of distant ice. You learn to live with silence. Not the kind that comes after a conversation ends, but the kind that fills a room after love has left it. Gregory knew that silence well. He'd been retired from the Coast Guard for almost a decade. Most mornings he woke up before the sun and brewed his coffee while the world was still dark. It was the kind of life he thought he'd earned: simple, quiet, steady. But after his old dog Scout passed away, even the things he used to enjoy, the sunrow over the ice shelf, the sound of wind scratching at the glass, felt hollow. Scout had been with him for 16 years. A mutt with one ear that never stood quite right, and eyes that always looked like they knew something you didn't. They'd gone through everything together: the long winters, the loss of Gregory's wife to cancer, and worst of all, the avalanche that had taken his son Marcus during a backcountry trip. Gregory never talked about Marcus, not out loud. But Scout had been there quietly at his feet when the world stopped making sense. And somehow, that dog had soaked up every unshed tear, every half-spoken prayer. So, when Scout died, Gregory didn't just lose a pet. He lost the last living witness to his grief. It's funny how the smallest things unravel you. The scratch at the door that never came again. The worn-down trail across the kitchen tile where Scout used to turn circles before lying down. The leash still hanging on the nail beside the door was untouched. Gregory couldn't bring himself to remove it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He told himself, as many do, that he was too old to begin again. Too tired to bond with another soul, only to lose it years later. And besides, no animal would ever be like Scout. That kind of bond, that wordless, fierce, quiet understanding, was once in a lifetime. So he stayed busy, chopping firewood, reading, sending supplies to the local wildlife rehab center tucked just beyond the airport road, where injured owls, fox kits, and the occasional Arctic hare came through in hopes of a second chance. He didn't visit, not really. He just dropped things off, nodded politely, then left before anyone could ask him how he was doing. But grief has a strange way of lingering. It doesn't shout, it waits. It settles into routines, into the way your hand hovers over 2 mugs in the cabinet before remembering you only need one. Into how you pause before opening the door expecting a cold nose to greet you. Silence in that way becomes its presence. Still, Gregory was never one to pity himself. He believed in dignity and staying useful, in doing things without making noise about it. The world was already loud enough. But there was one night that changed things. He'd been sorting through an old box of letters, things from his son's childhood, drawings of snow leopards and tigers scribbled in crayon. One note in Marcus's handwriting said, "Dad, when I grow up, I'm going to save every animal on Earth, starting with the polar bears." Gregory had forgotten that. It hit him harder than expected. Not just the memory, but the realization that the person he was supposed to become, the protector, the guide, the witness to his son's life, had outlived the very dream he'd once encouraged. And for what? To sit alone in a house full of memories too loud to ignore and too fragile to face. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the front porch, wrapped in an old flannel coat, eyes fixed on the horizon where the ice met the sky. The northern lights danced faintly above the trees. Scout wasn't coming back. Marcus wasn't either. But something inside him shifted, not a grand revelation, just a quiet, unsettling thought. What if healing doesn't come through forgetting, but through remembering in a new way? The next morning, Gregory drove a little farther than usual. Instead of turning back after his delivery to the wildlife center, he parked. Walked inside. No plan, no expectation. Just a pull something wordless that drew him forward. The front room smelled like pine shavings and snow boots. A volunteer offered him a coffee, which he declined. He looked at the board of animals currently under care, hawks, a seal pup, and a snowy owl. And near the bottom, a small line of text, polar bear cub, approx. 5 months old, non-releasable, under observation. His heart didn't leap. This wasn't a movie. It simply paused. Polar bears were wild, untouchable. Creatures of the ice, not companions. But still, he asked to see her. Her name, the handler said, was Iris. And before he could question why, he followed them past a narrow hallway toward the observation wing. No cameras, no phones, no contact, just a quiet space behind thick glass. And there she was, lying still, white fur matted from weeks of recovery, one paw still bandaged, eyes open, watching, no studying. Something in the way she looked at him was familiar, not in shape or color or sound, but in weight. Like she'd seen loss too, like she wasn't afraid of people, just tired of being disappointed by them. They stood in silence. 2 survivors on opposite sides of the glass. He didn't ask about adoption. He knew better. But that night he returned home and did something he hadn't done in years. He wrote a letter. Not to the center, not to anyone. Just a letter folded and placed in the drawer of his nightstand. It said, "If she ever chooses me, I'll be ready." In wildlife rescue across the US, especially in areas like Alaska, many animals are deemed unreleasable due to injury, trauma, or early separation. The process of finding safe, ethical homes for them is rare and complex. But sometimes, when both human and animal are holding space for something lost, something new can form something rooted in mutual need, not ownership. Wild animals aren't meant to be tamed, but perhaps under extraordinary circumstances, they don't need taming to form bonds. They need presence, consistency, and perhaps someone willing to sit with them in the quiet. Healing rarely looks like happiness. Sometimes it looks like stillness, like staying, like saying yes without knowing what happens next. Gregory didn't know it yet, but that quiet visit, nothing more than a glance, really had started a ripple. And in the cold, quiet north, even the smallest ripple can break through thick ice. In the days that followed, he would return. Not out of obligation, but because for the first time in a long time, silence no longer felt so heavy, and waiting behind the observation glass was Iris. She was watching, and maybe she was remembering too. The next time Gregory visited the wildlife center, he didn't tell anyone. No explanation. He just showed up, handed over a crate of firewood the staff hadn't asked for, and lingered a little longer than usual in the front hall. Nobody questioned it. In places where animals are trying to survive, you learn to give people space too. When he asked about the polar bear cub again, the handler, a young woman named Eliza, offered only a slow nod and pointed down the corridor. "She's still not responding much," she said. "Won't eat unless it's fish from the same bucket. Won't move unless she thinks no one's watching." Gregory didn't reply. He just walked quietly back toward the viewing glass. Iris was awake. She was stretched out in the far corner, head resting on her paws. Her breath fogged the window as she stared ahead, not at him, not at the room, but at something invisible and far off. He stood there for nearly 15 minutes. No phone, no tapping, no whispering of her name. He didn't even sit, just stood, hands in his coat pocket, matching her stillness with his own. He came again the following Thursday. And again the Tuesday after that. No one asked him to, but every time she was there. And over time she began to move just slightly. Her head would tilt. Her eyes would follow. Then one day she stood and walked across the enclosure, stopping close to the glass, placing her paw gently on the barrier. Gregory didn't move, but something in him exhaled. The staff began to notice. Eliza mentioned it one morning over black coffee in the entryway. "You're the only one she does that with," she said, not quite believing it herself. "She doesn't even react to the vet like that." Gregory only shrugged. "I'm not doing anything." That might be why. In wildlife rehabilitation, especially with apex predators like polar bears, human interaction is intentionally limited. The goal is survival, not social bonding. But in rare, non-releasable cases where animals are orphaned too young or injured beyond rehabilitation, some caregivers become long-term constants, not companions, not owners, just quiet anchors. That's what Gregory became. Over the next month, he learned her patterns. She hated the sound of clanking metal, preferred to sleep tucked near heat vents, wouldn't touch frozen fish unless it had fully thawed. "She's picky," Eliza said once. "No," Gregory corrected gently. "She's cautious." There was a difference. Iris had been rescued along the northern rim of Prudhoe Bay, not far from where oil operations hum beneath the snow. She'd been found near a drift pile, limping her mother nowhere in sight. The assumption was abandonment, but Eliza had a different theory. "She didn't leave," she said one afternoon, her voice low. "She was likely shot. There's been tension between the bulls and the bears for years. This one, she got lucky. Someone found her before the wolves did." Gregory didn't ask for more. He didn't need to. Something about the story of that cub, separated from her mother, forced to navigate ice and hunger and noise, rang too close to something else he'd buried long ago. Marcus. His son had been 24 when the avalanche took him. A volunteer guide at a winter camp for troubled teens. Brave. Kind. Too kind, Gregory used to think. He'd given away his gloves that day to a camper who'd lost his in the snow. They found Marcus's body 2 days later. He'd died helping someone else. The irony wasn't lost on Gregory. A boy who loved polar bears, a father who couldn't save him, and now, this creature, left behind, cautious, watching him like she saw something he didn't even know was there. Polar bear cubs are fully dependent on their mothers for at least 2 years. Without her, they cannot learn essential survival behaviors, how to hunt seals, break sea ice, and avoid males. Once orphaned, they often don't survive more than a few weeks. Iris had been 5 months old when found. Malnourished, injured, and too young to have ever learned what it meant to be wild, which made her unreleasable. Not because she wasn't strong, but because she'd never had the chance to be wild the right way. Gregory found himself thinking about that distinction a lot. Maybe wildness isn't about danger. Maybe it's about not belonging to anyone, not being explained. Maybe Iris wasn't broken. Maybe she was just unfinished. Over time, Gregory began to write again, not letters to anyone in particular, just notes, observations, fragments. She doesn't trust quickly, but she never forgets kindness. When she sleeps, her nose twitches like she's smelling something only she remembers. The way she looks at the window is the way I used to look at Scout when I was too sad to speak. He didn't show the staff. He didn't even call it a journal. He just folded the pages and kept them tucked in an old weatherproof notebook beside the wood stove. Eliza, seeing his visits become regular, finally asked one morning if he'd like to sit in on one of the therapy assessments. "Just observation," she said, "a quiet session." Gregory agreed. Inside the secondary enclosure, behind another pane of glass, Iris paced briefly before stopping in the middle of the room. Then she did something strange. She sat, turned, and stared directly at Gregory. The behaviorist made a note. "She does that with you. Eye contact. Direct, calm." Gregory didn't reply. But later, when he left, he whispered to Eliza, It's not calm. It's permission. Because what Iris was doing, what many might call connection, was something simpler. She wasn't asking for love. She wasn't even asking to be saved. She was saying, I see you, and I'm still here. Not every bond is about affection. Sometimes it's about co-survival, witnessing, remaining. You don't have to fix something wild for it to matter. You just have to show up again and again. In Churchill, Manitoba, where polar bear encounters are common, wildlife experts have observed that orphaned cubs develop unique behavioral traits, especially when exposed to humans during recovery. Some remain distant. Others remember specific caretakers, even years later, responding not with affection, but with recognition. Iris had begun to recognize Gregory. And in his quiet way, Gregory had started to recognize her not as a stand-in for his son, replacement for Scout, but as a being entirely her own. He hadn't held her. He hadn't touched her, but they had shared something that most people never quite understand, presence without demand. That night back in his cabin, Gregory added a new page to the notebook. She's not meant to live in a house, I know that. But maybe she's meant to live somewhere that remembers how to listen. He didn't know if the center would ever consider placing Iris in a private care environment. The rules were strict, the risks high, but he wasn't planning. He was simply preparing for what he didn't know. Only that something in the silence between them felt different now. Less like distance, more like waiting. It wasn't until the third week on a morning, so still the air outside cracked like glass, that Iris did something no one expected. She stood up, walked to the glass, and stayed there for almost 10 minutes. And the look in her eyes wasn't fear. It was a choice. What happened next would change everything. Gregory didn't set out to write it. It started with a single sentence scribbled on the corner of a feed delivery slip. Some things don't leave, they just change shape. He didn't know if he was talking about grief about Iris or himself. That evening, after he'd returned home and stoked the wood stove, he made tea and sat in the kitchen, same chair as always, same cup, same flickering lamp. But this time something felt different. Not in the room. In him. He pulled out an old stationery box from the cabinet. The paper inside still smelled faintly like cedar. The kind his wife used to write grocery lists on back when everything in their lives had seemed manageable. And he began to write. Dear Iris, he started and then paused. It felt ridiculous. A letter to a polar bear. She couldn't read. She wouldn't understand, but somehow that made it easier. So he kept going. I don't know why you look at me the way you do, but something in your eyes reminds me of someone I used to know, someone I haven't dared to think about in a long time. My son. His name was Marcus. He loved polar bears, used to draw them in the margins of his homework. Once when he was about 9, he made me promise that if he ever disappeared, I'd keep saving animals for him. I laughed then, but I'm not laughing now. He stopped. The ink had started to run from his grip, pressing too hard. He loosened his hand, took a breath, and continued. You remind me of him. Not in how you look, but in the way you're always watching like the world already taught you too much too fast. I don't want to rescue you. I just want you to know I'm here. If you choose me. Didn't sign it. He folded the paper and slipped it into an envelope, then tucked it under a loose floorboard in his bedroom, the same place he kept Marcus's last drawing. He never intended to show it to anyone, especially not to Iris. But it was the first time in years he'd written something that wasn't a grocery list or a donation form. It wasn't for the world. It was for the space between his pain and hers. Writing letters to the dead or all non-human beings is a known therapeutic method in grief counseling. It's a way to externalize pain, clarify memory, and express things that the heart still carries but the voice can't release. Among older adults, especially those living alone, this act can restore a small but vital sense of connection. That night, Gregory didn't sleep well. His dreams were half-formed icy water paw prints in snow. A child's laughter echoing down a hallway that no longer existed. The next morning, he did something spontaneous. He returned to the center before visiting hours. The snow hadn't been cleared yet. He parked, crooked, his boots crunching over the frost as he made his way to the back entrance. He knocked once, twice. Then Eliza appeared bleary-eyed but smiling. "You again," she said. "Coffee's not even brewed yet." "I brought my own," he replied, lifting a thermos. "Mind if I sit with her?" She tilted her head, studied him, then opened the door. "I'll give you 10 minutes. She's been quiet today." He stepped into the viewing room. The lights were dimmed low to mimic dawn. Iris was curled in the corner facing the opposite wall. Gregory didn't speak. He just stood there, the thermos warming his fingers, and then slowly she rose. She turned, walked toward the glass, and sat. They stayed that way for minutes that felt like a held breath. Gregory reached into his coat pocket, not for the letter, but for a pen. He wrote something on the back of his hand. Just one word: still. Sometimes healing isn't progress. It's not movement or forward steps. It's choosing to remain, to stay soft in a world that keeps asking you to harden. That day, the handlers asked Gregory if he'd ever considered applying for extended contact clearance. It was rare, reserved only for animals marked as non-releasable and with significant psychological dependence. "She remembers you," Eliza said. "Not just your face, your presence. That's not common." Gregory didn't answer right away. He went home, took the letter from under the floorboard, read it again, this time slower. He didn't cry, but something in his posture softened. Later that night, he added a second page. "I know this will never be a normal thing, but maybe normal was never the goal. Maybe what you and I are doing, just showing up for each other, is enough. Maybe it's more than enough." In 2013, a permanently injured grizzly named Brutus became a lifelong companion to naturalist Casey Anderson in Montana. Though never treated as a pet, their relationship was built on trust and mutual respect. It raised questions, but also inspired thousands who believed wild animals and humans could share space without exploitation, without force. Gregory wasn't trying to replicate that. He wasn't thinking about making headlines. He just wanted to stop feeling like everything he touched eventually left. Grief changes shape. First, it's a wave. Then it's a weight. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it becomes a language. One that doesn't need words. One that gets spoken through presence, patience, and the unspoken promise to stay. Eliza called 3 days later. Her voice was quiet. Careful. Her condition's stabilizing. She's eating more. Sleeping better. She's still wary around most of us, but with you. Gregory waited. She leans toward the window when you leave. He didn't say anything. But after the call, he folded the letter one last time and placed it in a new envelope. This one he labeled with a name. "If I go first, this is for Iris." And beneath that, in smaller handwriting, "Tell her I stayed." That's all she needs to know. Some bonds don't ask to be defined. They don't arrive with logic or plans. They arrive in stillness, in the gaze of a wild animal that doesn't beg, doesn't plead, but remains. 2 weeks later, during a midday session, Gregory was allowed into the indoor acclimation space just for observation. Still no contact. But Iris didn't wait behind the glass this time. She stood, walked to him, and placed her paw softly, deliberately against the mesh between them. Not asking, not testing, just answering. It wasn't the beginning of a friendship. It was the confirmation of something older, and just beyond that moment, behind every breath and heartbeat, something darker waited, something that would test everything they had just begun to trust. Gregory had grown used to the rhythm. Mornings were quiet drives down frost-lined roads, hands wrapped around a travel mug. Afternoons were for wood chopping, mending old nets, or tinkering with a generator. And on certain days that arrived like gentle tides, he'd find himself at the wildlife center, standing near the acclimation mesh, while Iris sat watching him without blinking. It was becoming normal, or at least something like it. But the past doesn't knock politely. It doesn't ask if you're ready. It simply walks in like it owns the place. It happened on a Wednesday. A new staff member had just been transferred from a larger rescue facility in Anchorage. His name was Carl. Mid-40s, efficient, well-meaning. He introduced himself quickly, shook Gregory's hand without making eye contact, and then walked with confident steps toward Iris's enclosure. "Let's see how the girl's doing," he said, voice loud, clipped. The moment he stepped into the hallway outside Iris's room, everything changed. She froze, ears back, tail rigid. Then a sound Gregory hadn't heard from her not once in all those months. A deep, low growl. Not defensive, not startled. Something older. Carl paused mid-step, confused. What the hell? But Iris didn't give him time to recover. She charged not recklessly, but with terrifying precision toward the mesh, slamming both front paws against it, teeth bared. Eliza ran in from the other hall. "Step back," she ordered sharply. "Now." Carl stumbled back. Iris didn't move. Her chest was heaving. Her eyes stayed locked on him, wide and burning. Gregory had never seen her like that. Later, when the room had been cleared and Iris had returned to the far corner, still on edge, still vibrating with tension, Gregory pulled Eliza aside. "What just happened?" Eliza's face was pale. "We've only seen that response once. Months ago, when she first arrived. It took 3 of us to sedate her. Same posture, same snarl. Was it a sound, a scent maybe? But the only constant was that it was always a man. A man with a voice like Carl's. They didn't speculate aloud, but the possibilities were heavy in the air. There'd been whispers early on that Iris hadn't been found by accident. That maybe she hadn't simply been left behind. That some rough encounter with a poacher or human threat had shaped the fear in her bones. Carl, to his credit, didn't argue. He asked to be reassigned quietly without making it a scene. But the damage was done. For the first time, Gregory saw Iris not as a cautious survivor, but as someone carrying trauma she didn't have the words to name. Studies in wildlife trauma show that orphaned predators, especially apex species like grizzlies and polar bears, can form deep specific responses to triggers that mirror their past injuries. Unlike domestic animals, their memory isn't shaped by training, but by survival. A tone, a scent, a rhythm of footsteps can send them spiraling. That evening, back at home, Gregory sat at the kitchen table longer than usual. He didn't light the stove. Just sat there in the half-dark, turning a mug in his hand. What if he wasn't enough? What if all this, every visit, every quiet hour, every letter, wasn't reaching her the way he thought it was? He'd spent months thinking Iris saw something in him. But what if all she saw was less threat, not trust, just tolerance? And what if he wasn't strong enough to carry both her silence and her shadows? He stood across the room and opened the cabinet where he kept the folder of application forms. Inside was a packet marked Relocation Protocol. It detailed the process for moving an animal to long-term sanctuary placement or, if needed, back to restricted care. He read the first paragraph, then the second, then he stopped. Because Iris had never asked for him to be her hero. She had never asked for comfort. She had only asked that he stay. The instinct to walk away when something breaks is deeply human. But trust, real trust, doesn't come from fixing what's broken. It comes from standing still when everything inside you wants to run. The next morning, Gregory returned early. No announcement, no hesitation. Just a quiet walk into the viewing area. Iris was in her usual corner. Still, eyes open, watching. He sat down on the cold bench, didn't speak, didn't move. Minutes passed. Then Iris stood, walked slowly, cautiously toward the mesh, and laid down. Not close, but not far. She wasn't testing him. She was letting him stay. Gregory didn't cry. He just reached for the notebook in his coat and wrote 4 words, "I won't leave first." In the world of wildlife rescue, the focus is often on physical healing, resetting bones, closing wounds. But psychological healing, especially for animals who've endured human cruelty, is more fragile. It doesn't come from technique. It comes from time, presence, patterns of non-harm. That week, Eliza suggested introducing a new handler. A woman named Brooke, with a softer voice and slower approach. Over several sessions, Iris began to relax again. Her sleep returned, her pacing eased. But something had changed. From then on, every time Gregory arrived, Iris would approach and press her side, not her paw, not her head against the mesh. Just for a moment, and then step away. A quiet offering. In Alaska's North Slope region, several polar bear cubs have been rescued in recent years due to ice loss and human interaction. One particularly famous case involved a cub who refused all human contact for nearly 6 months, until one technician who sat silently outside her pen each morning for weeks was able to get close enough for care. The cub never became tame, but her survival hinged entirely on that small, steady act of showing up. Gregory didn't want to change Iris. He just wanted to be the person she could count on not to change. That night, he reread the letter in the floorboard, then added a 3rd page. If she forgets me one day, I'll be okay. But if she ever remembers me as the one who stayed, that will be enough. But healing like wildness isn't linear. And trust, no matter how gently built, can be shaken by a single moment of absence, especially when the one who taught you to feel safe suddenly disappears. It started with the wind. Not a gust, but a steady moan that rolled through Barrow like a warning. Gregory had lived through dozens of Alaskan winters, but this wind felt different, restless, not strong. It carried the kind of chill that made animals go quiet, made the air feel like it was waiting for something. He was chopping kindling behind the cabin when his radio crackled. Eliza's voice came through tense but composed. "Gregory, we've got a situation." Iris got out. He dropped the axe before the words even finished. She explained fast. A latch on the outdoor acclimation yard hadn't clicked into place. A sudden crosswind had blown the gate open. Iris had wandered off, calm, not frantic, but now she was gone. No tracks, just wind and white. She didn't run, Eliza said. She walked, like she knew where she was going. Gregory didn't answer. He was already pulling on his coat. Within 30 minutes, he was at the center. The staff had begun a search perimeter, but visibility was dropping fast. It wasn't just so, it was the kind of blinding white that swallowed shapes whole. Even seasoned trackers struggled to read the land in this kind of weather. Gregory didn't wait for a team. He asked where she was last seen and set out alone. He knew the area, knew where the land dipped, where the birches thinned. He followed the slope behind the enclosures past the tree line into the outskirts of the woodland edge where the wind couldn't reach so sharply. He didn't shout her name. That wouldn't help. He just moved, listening. Crunch, pause. Crunch, pause. Then he saw it. A partial paw print near a thawing stream, small, precise, with the back edge slightly dragging. It was her. He followed. The trees thickened. The light dropped. But he kept moving. Polar bears are not forest dwellers, but when young and disoriented, or if born in transitional zones, they will occasionally wander inland, especially if separated from sea ice or food sources. In northern Alaska, there are documented cases of cubs found deep in spruce patches, miles from where they should have been. Gregory didn't find her near the stream or the ridge. He found her beneath an old pine tree curled tightly into herself, barely visible beneath a dusting of snow. She didn't move when he approached, didn't growl, didn't flinch. She looked up, slowly, and Gregory knelt. No words, just one hand placed carefully against the snow, close but not touching. "I'm here," he said, voice steady. Iris didn't rise right away, but she shifted, turned her head slightly. Then just as slowly she pushed herself upright and limped the 2 steps between them. She rested her side against his leg. Not for warmth, for recognition. Not all fear is loud. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like disappearing, not because trust was broken, but because it was tested. Gregory stayed there until her breathing evened out. Then together they began the long walk back. It took over an hour. The wind softened only once they reached the clearing. When they returned to the center, no one said anything. Eliza opened the gate without a word. Iris walked through it without hesitation. Later, over coffee, Eliza asked, "How did you find her?" Gregory looked down at his cup. "I just went where it hurt." He didn't mean physically. He meant the place where memories lived. because the tree where he'd found Iris wasn't random. It was the same clearing where 10 years earlier he had scattered Marcus's ashes. He hadn't been back since. Sometimes the wild chooses to take us to places we avoid, not to hurt us, but to show us what we're still carrying. What we haven't buried, no matter how carefully we've tried. That night back home, Gregory didn't write in the notebook. He sat with the letter again, reread the 3rd page. Then he added a 4th. You found the one place that I thought I'd never return to. And you waited there. You reminded me that grief doesn't disappear, it circles back. Not to wound, but to invite us to stay with it without turning away. He folded the letter, placed it in the envelope. But this time, instead of hiding it, he left it on the windowsill. Iris slept well that night. The next morning, she was calm, ate without prompting, allowed Eliza to sit just feet away. Gregory watched from the hallway. She was recovering, but the staff knew something had shifted. Iris had passed through something, not just a gate, but a threshold. The next day, the center director called Gregory into her office. They'd reviewed the data, watched the footage, consulted the vet, and they were ready to discuss a transition plan, not a full release. Iris could never return to the wild. But perhaps, not unlike other cases of non-releasable apex animals, she could be placed under strict private guardianship. Limited access, regular inspections, no commercial use, no exposure to strangers. A true sanctuary built not for show, but for solitude. They asked if Gregory would be willing. He didn't say yes. He didn't need to, he just nodded. In rare, highly regulated cases, apex predators like wolves or polar bears have been placed in private care sanctuaries under strict oversight, especially when deemed psychologically unsuitable for larger facilities. These are not pets, they're survivors. Their placements are never about comfort, they're about necessity and mutual stability. Gregory spent the next week making preparations. He cleared a section of the back property, reinforced the fencing, and repurposed the old fishing shed into a sleeping den. The center sent in specialists to assist. But Iris didn't wait until the transition was finished to make her choice clear. One morning, as Gregory stood by the transport gate, she walked directly to him, brushing her side against his coat. Not clinging, just saying, "This time I'm not going alone." Trust once broken doesn't rebuild through promises. It rebuilds through presence, through staying especially in the storm. By the end of the month, the final papers were signed. Iris would leave the center not to return to the wild, but to live as close to it as possible alongside someone who understood that healing wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was about remembering what still had value. And in the quiet of that new home, something unexpected began to take shape. Not just safety, but ritual, a new kind of life built side by side. There were forms, dozens of them. Gregory sat at the center's long wooden table, flipping through a stack nearly an inch thick. Words like custodial care, non-releasable clause, and apex species permit filled every page. "This isn't a pet adoption," the director reminded him gently. "This is legal stewardship of a federally protected animal." He nodded. He wasn't here to tame a polar bear. He wasn't here to prove he could handle one. He was here because the alternative, moving Iris to a larger, more clinical long-term facility hundreds of miles away, wasn't right. Not for her. Not anymore. Over the last several weeks, Iris had become increasingly attuned to him. She ate when he sat nearby, rested when he read aloud from old weather logs, pushed her nose against the enclosure when she heard his boots crunch the gravel. "She's chosen," Eliza said once. "We don't know why. But she has." And so began the process of applying for what was known as a Category 3 placement, a rarely granted exception under Alaska's wildlife rehabilitation law. It allowed for the conditional placement of a non-releasable wild animal into private care if 3 conditions were met. The animal's psychological or physical state made it unsuitable for further relocation. The potential caregiver had sufficient land security and non-commercial intent. A licensed veterinarian and 2 behavioral specialists endorsed the match. Gregory's property was large enough. His intentions were clear. And more importantly, every person at the center had seen the way Iris behaved with him. Still, the state required oversight, regular inspections, no public viewing, no YouTube channels, no polar bear pet headlines. Gregory didn't want any of that anyway. He didn't want to show Iris to the world. He just wanted to make her invisible wounds easier to carry. In 2015, a blind grizzly in Montana was granted sanctuary under similar conditions deemed unreleasable after a poaching injury. She was housed by a former wildlife ranger in a secure habitat built into the edge of his rural property. Though controversial, the case set a precedent for compassionate exceptions grounded in long-term care and mutual trust. Gregory understood the weight of what he was taking on. Iris was still a polar bear, an animal with instincts sharper than any domestic pet, with strength that could, under fear or distress, break through the best fencing. But he'd learned to read her rhythms, the slight shift of her shoulders when anxious, the subtle, slow blink when she was calm, the way she lowered her head not submissively but thoughtfully before lying down near him. Iris wasn't tame. She was aware, and Gregory didn't want to change that. There's a misconception that to love a wild thing is to transform it to make it safe, soft, domesticated. But real love doesn't remove wildness. It respects it. It builds boundaries strong enough to hold trust without containing it. The day the approval came, Gregory said nothing. He simply stood on his porch as the transport truck rolled in. The air was clean and cold, the kind of day that smelled like cedar and snow. The handlers opened the back. Iris stepped out cautiously. She paused, nose raised, then walked forward, not as if arriving somewhere new, but as if returning to something familiar. She didn't inspect the yard, didn't pace the edges. She walked straight to the large flat stone Gregory had placed beneath the old spruce tree and sat. Not because she was told, because she recognized it. It was the same kind of rock she used to curl against at the center, and she knew. This was home. The law may define custody, but home is chosen by something quieter, something felt, not declared. That evening, Gregory's niece arrived. Madison, early 30s, bright, firm, and never one to avoid a hard question. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, staring into the enclosure. "That's a polar bear," she said flatly. Gregory didn't argue. "You know this isn't normal, right?" He nodded. "She's not a cat. She's not your old dog. What happens if she snaps? What happens if something goes wrong?" "I know who she is," he said, "and I know who I am with her." Madison exhaled, half frustration, half awe. "You've always done things the hard way." "No," Gregory replied. "I've just learned that some things are worth the effort." They sat in silence. Then, as if sensing the shift, Iris stood and walked slowly to the edge of her fence. She didn't approach fast, didn't roar. She just stood there, watching. Madison stared back, eyes narrowed, then softened. "She's aware." "Yes," Gregory said. "Very." And just like that, the conversation ended, not in agreement, but in a kind of unspoken understanding across the U.S. Sanctuaries for wild animals often walk the line between legality and emotional necessity. Many operate under provisional permits, often quietly, because the animals in their care are too broken or too bonded to thrive elsewhere. These aren't zoos. They're shelters for the rare kind of connection that can't be replicated or explained. Gregory's property became just that. Not a showcase, a space of coexistence. Days passed. The rhythm settled. In the mornings, Iris would rise before the sun and lie near the gate watching as Gregory poured his coffee. In the evenings, she'd press her side against the wire mesh as he spoke quiet words, half memories not always meant to be heard. And some nights, she would sleep near the wall closest to his bedroom window, close enough that in winter he could hear her breathing in the dark. He added another note to his letter. "She doesn't follow. She doesn't obey, but she stays. And that somehow is enough to make this place feel alive again." Legal clarity may draw the boundaries of what's allowed, but the gold, the real worth, lies in the spaces where trust is chosen, where a wild animal against all odds decides not to run. Not because she's trained, but because someone stayed. And in that quiet ritual of staying, something new began to grow. Not control, not comfort, but a rhythm. A life not led side by side, but in orbit. Two wild things learning how to share silence one moment at a time. Healing didn't come with fireworks. It didn't come with a turning point or some grand reveal. It came in the form of rhythm, of things quietly repeating. Gregory woke each morning to the same sound, the soft scrape of paws across frozen dirt. A muffled exhale just outside his window, and then silence. Iris always waited there in the early dim light, not asking to be let in, just existing close by. He made coffee. She walked the fence line, once never pacing, just tracing. He read from a battered book, Arctic Wildlife and the Edge of Ice, sitting on a bench he built with his own hands, while Iris lay under the spruce tree, ears turned slightly in his direction. And that was how their days began. No instructions, no schedule, just the steady unfolding of presence. This wasn't a story about transformation. Gregory didn't wake up one day healed from grief. Iris didn't become cuddly or tame. But something had shifted. They were no longer waiting for each other to leave. They were building a life on the quiet certainty that neither of them would. In wildlife sanctuaries across the world, the most successful human-animal relationships aren't built on control, they're built on routine. Bears in particular thrive on predictability. Feeding times, behavioral observation, and gentle proximity all help foster a sense of safety. For many animals who have experienced trauma, stability is more healing than affection. Gregory saw it in the smallest things. The way Iris tilted her head slightly when she heard the kettle whistle, as if listening for some unspoken signal. The way she curled beside the enclosure's baseboard heater. The same way she had at the rehab center, favoring warmth over open space. The way she stayed just out of reach, but never far out of sight. In the evenings, Gregory spoke more. Not in full conversations, more like pieces of memory scattered like leaves. "I used to think I'd paint one day," he said once while Iris watched the snow collect along the fence. "Got as far as buying brushes. Sold them after my boy died." He didn't say Marcus's name often, but when he did, Iris never moved. That somehow made it easier. We often think of healing as something that happens inside of us, but sometimes it happens beside us. In the presence of something or someone who never asks us to move faster than we're ready to. Gregory kept his days simple. He tended the greenhouse, brewed tea, fixed things that didn't need fixing. He kept the gate latch oiled, even though Iris had never tried to push it again. Every Thursday, a vet came to check her mobility, her diet, and her behavior. The reports were always the same stable alert, not aggressive. "She's not regressing," they said. What they didn't say, but what Gregory already knew, was that she was remembering. Not the pain, not the escape, the stillness, the rituals, the life she was creating with him. He added a new line to his journal. "She doesn't look at me for direction. She looks at me to confirm that I'm still here." One afternoon during a light snow, Iris stood near the edge of the fence while Gregory sketched something in the dirt with a stick, just a habit. He drew a wave, then a boat, then a mountain. When he looked up, Iris was copying the motion with her paw, clumsily tracing the shape beside his. He didn't move, didn't smile, just drew another. And she did too. Not perfectly, not playfully, but purposefully. Like the act of mirroring was her way of saying, "I understand you." Mirror behavior in animals, especially bears, is rare, but documented in environments of sustained safety. When not stressed, some species exhibit curiosity toward human actions, mimicking not because they're trained, but because they're engaged. It's not a submission, it's participation. The first time Madison saw this, she didn't say anything. She just leaned against the porch railing and watched. "She doesn't act like a wild animal," she whispered. "She is a wild animal," Gregory replied. "She just doesn't act like she's alone anymore." There was a long pause. "You're not either," Madison said quietly. Gregory didn't answer. But later, when she was gone, he stood under the spruce tree and whispered a thank you he hadn't known he'd needed to say. To Iris, to Marcus, to the silence that had once felt unbearable but now felt full. We often look for healing in big moments, in breakthroughs. But the deepest healing happens in repetition, in showing up, in doing the same small act of care again and again until the world begins to feel safe enough to expand. Winter deepened. The days shortened. Iris grew stronger, heavier, slower but calmer. She began to sleep with one paw pressed lightly against the base of the den wall closest to Gregory's house. Like a signal. Still here. He began placing a small flat rock just outside her gate every few days. A quiet offering, nothing expected, just shared space. Sometimes she moved them, sometimes she ignored them, but not once did she destroy them. Each morning Gregory checked to see if they'd been touched. It became its ritual, its language. In certain sanctuaries, caregivers report consistent patterns of nonverbal communication with animals. Over time, bears who leave objects in specific places who alter behavior subtly when familiar caretakers are ill or upset. It's not magic, it's memory. It's trust encoded into action. Gregory added one last entry to his journal that month. Some connections are too quiet to explain. But you feel them like heat from a stove you didn't know was lit. They weren't healing because they had found each other. They were healing because they had stopped needing to protect themselves from each other. And in that safety ritual was born, not as a habit, but as proof that something new was being written one day at a time. But rituals don't last forever. And on one golden evening, when the wind was soft and the light slanted just right, Iris did something she'd never done before. She turned toward the trees, and Gregory knew before she even took a step that the wild still called to her. It always had. But the question was no longer if she would leave. It was when. It was late summer, the kind that glows like honey and doesn't ask questions. The kind of day where the wind barely moves the leaves, but everything still feels like it's shifting. Gregory stood on the porch with his hands around a chipped enamel mug, the same one he'd used since his Coast Guard days. The sky was layered in gold low clouds, casting long shadows over the tree line. And beside him, like she had been every morning for months, was Iris. She didn't lean against the fence that day. She stood a little straighter, head higher, nose tilted toward the woods. It was subtle, so small it might have gone unnoticed, but Gregory felt it, like a string being loosened. Not broken, just released. He didn't speak, just watched her take one slow step forward, then another. She paused at the edge of the trees, then looked back. Not with hesitation, but with recognition. Gregory gave a quiet nod. That was all. Iris disappeared into the tree line with the kind of grace only wild animals carry. The kind of grace that says, "I remember where I came from and I know where I'm going." He didn't follow. He wouldn't have. That wasn't the kind of relationship they had. Instead, he went back inside and poured the rest of his coffee down the sink. The house was quiet. But it wasn't empty. There's a kind of goodbye that doesn't ache. One that feels like a deep exhale. It doesn't come from loss, it comes from completion. Over the next few days, Gregory kept the gate open, left food in the usual place, water near the old spruce tree, but the offering remained untouched. And then one morning he found it her paw print. Not near the gate, but by the porch. Just one. No others. Just that. In the wild, polar bears have been observed returning briefly to places of comfort, especially those raised in semi-captive environments. Not out of dependence, but as part of a known route. A final lap, one last imprint. Gregory sat with that print for hours. He didn't take a photo, didn't trace it, just sat beside it, one hand resting on the ground. A week later, a staff member from the Wildlife Center called. "There's been sightings," she said. A polar bear cub, larger, now spotted just north of the coast. Not bothering camps, just moving. Healthy, alone, but calm. Gregory didn't ask for proof. He just nodded and whispered, "That sounds like her." Polar bears are known for their incredible memory. Their ability to remember food sources, threats, and safe terrain is unmatched among land predators. In captivity, those cognitive maps don't vanish, they shift. If they return to the wild in time, they adapt. If they leave too late, they don't. But Iris, she had left just on the edge of enough. She had healed in a sanctuary, not by forgetting what she was, but by remembering who she could still become. We talk a lot about rescue, about safety, about what we offer wild animals, but rarely do we talk about what they offer us. Iris gave Gregory silence that felt alive. Purpose without noise, connection without words. She gave him mornings to wake up for, stories to tell, a reason to keep something warm on the stove. And when she left, she didn't take that with her. She left it behind, etched into the wood, the soil, the rhythm. Gregory returned to his life. Quiet, yes, but never as quiet as before. He fixed the greenhouse, started drawing again, nothing fancy, just lines in a notebook, bears, trees, his son's name. He kept the letter, but he didn't write more. There was nothing left to say. It was all said in the staying, in the choice to be there, not to possess, not to protect, but to witness. Maybe you've known a silence like that? The kind that arrives after something precious has passed through your life. The kind that at first feels like absence and then someday starts to feel like presence in a different form. Maybe it was a pet, a person, a place, or a version of yourself you had to say goodbye to. And maybe like Gregory, you're learning that healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it tiptoes. Sometimes it curls up quietly beside you until one day you realize the ache has changed shape. Not gone, just gentler. In wildlife rescue, not every story ends with an animal staying. Sometimes the greatest success is rewilding and not returning a creature to the life it had, but freeing it into the life it was always meant for. And sometimes that rewilding happens in us too. We remember how to live without holding on too tightly. We learn how to let something leave and still feel full. I never named her wild. She already was. I just gave her a place to remember that safely. And in doing that, she gave me back a piece of myself I didn't know was still alive. Now, take a moment and ask yourself, what in your life have you been holding too tightly? What pain, memory, or connection have you mistaken as loss when maybe it was a gift? Think about the wild parts of you, the ones that aren't broken, just waiting for safe company. If this story stirred something in you, stay close. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, real ones. Quiet ones, ones that remind us what it means to still be alive inside. And if you felt seen in this story, like it understood something you haven't put into words yet, leave a comment. Not for me, for you. Because maybe your story's not over either, and you never know who's listening in the quiet.